This is a great group. Someone asked me earlier if I get nervous speaking to large groups of people, and I said, I've got 6 kids. The oldest is 9, the youngest is 6 months. This is relaxing. This is nothing compared to what I do on a daily basis. So, truly, I am glad to be here. I actually used to live here, so it's really a pleasure to be back. I didn't know if I would ever end up back in Bismarck. I went to Rita Murphy Elementary, which I think is not too far from here, and my parents and I moved around a lot, and we always said that Bismarck was one of our favorite places. Maybe not so much for the weather, but we do recall that the people were so warm and friendly and supportive of one another, and we always miss that, oddly enough. So truly, it's a pleasure to be back. And I was an atheist even as a child when I lived here, so a lot's happened since then that I have to catch you up on, and I look forward to telling you my story. One of the reasons is because it just fills me with joy to talk about what God has done in my life. But the other reason is that I think it might help you as you pray for and you reach out to people you might know who have fallen away. And I'm guessing that you do know at least a few people who have fallen away, or maybe they've always been atheists or whatever. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of Americans who do not identify with any religion continues to grow at a rapid pace. 1/5 of the U.S. public and 1/3 of adults under 30 are religiously unaffiliated today, the highest percentage ever in Pew Research polling. In the last 5 years alone, the unaffiliated have increased from just over 15% to about 20% of all adults in this country. Their ranks now include more than 13 million self-described atheists and agnostics, and we are only talking about our own country here. As well as nearly 33 million people who say they have no particular religious affiliation. In Austin, we call that spiritual but not religious. 1/3 of people who say they were raised Catholic no longer practice. So we have our work cut out for us. Let's start to turn those statistics around. And so let me start by telling you my own story from when I used to be one of those statistics. So I was always an atheist. I have no memories of believing in anything supernatural, not even when I was a child. I would sit in the class down at Rita Murphy Elementary, and sometimes, I think it was actually here in Bismarck, that a girl asked me, she said, have you made him the Lord of your life? And I actually said, who? It never occurred to me to believe in anything like that, and I certainly had no religious training. My parents, mainly my dad, had this idea that they wanted to be good people just for the sake of being good people. They are, to this day, they are very kind and generous individuals. And my dad especially really liked this idea of, why don't we do good out of the goodness of our hearts? You may have heard this before from people you know who don't believe. Why do we need a God, threatening us with hell to do the right thing? Can't we just do the right thing on our own? And that made perfect sense to me. It was really my dad who was the atheist of the family, and he was raised, I think, kind of non-practicing Methodist, but he started to ask some tough questions when he was a teen, and he didn't get answers, so he was, pretty open about his atheism. My mother is what philosophers call a Macyist, and that's someone who is far more concerned with whether Macy's has an additional 30% off this weekend than whether there's a compelling case for a monotheistic God. So, and my dad would say, and if he were here, and he actually thought about coming, which would have been weird, if he were here, I think that he would say that he did not raise me to be an atheist per se. He was really big on this idea of seek truth and question assumptions. Even if it's something that I, as your father, am telling you, question it. Seek truth. And so that would end up being a very important part of my childhood, that it wasn't just we're atheists, so go be an atheist. It was seek truth, question assumptions. And so I did, and as a young person, that seemed to lead me to atheism. I went to college. I actually started out at a very religious public university, and I transferred to the University of Texas at Austin because it had a reputation for being very secular. At my previous university, it was like, they'd have Bible studies and stuff, and I got to UT and I thought, atheists, yeah, this is much more like it. So the college atheists who I hung out with, and really even some of the professors, they were really a testament to just how much our education system has lost a sense of history when it comes to philosophy and the liberal arts. I mean, I would actually hear professors say things like, well, belief in God started because people didn't know how to explain things before science, and that's the only reason anyone ever believes. And now that I have studied a little bit of philosophy, I'm no expert, but now that I've just cracked the surface on it, I think, I cannot believe that people got away with saying that in an institution of higher learning. I mean, have you never read the ancient Greek philosophers? I mean, you might not agree with them, but there's this whole wealth of knowledge that they were not drawing from. And what it reminds me of is one of my very favorite quotes ever, sums up this whole phenomenon. It was the London Review of Books, their review of, I believe it was The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, otherwise known as your atheist relative's favorite book, I'm sure. What they said, and I can just hear the British accent, I wish I could imitate it. They said of The God Delusion, imagine someone holding forth on biology whose only knowledge of the subject is the British Book of Birds, and you have a rough idea of what it feels like to read Richard Dawkins on theology. So, I love that, and that really perfectly encapsulates what I experienced among atheists, even in a university setting. And it was interesting, though, because we like to have these discussions. We like to ask big questions and, think tough thoughts that the Christians supposedly weren't thinking. But I began to notice some problems would come up that people couldn't really answer that well. For example, someone asked one time in an atheist group that I was meeting with, how do we know that it's the right thing to do to be a good person, for example, to just, give back to others, maybe volunteer at a homeless shelter? Because the group that I was with, they were really into that. They really did want to be good people, like my parents, serve the community, give back. And so they said, from an atheistic point of view, obviously we're not like those silly Christians whose God tells them what to do. But so how do we know that it's the right thing to do? And the person in the room who was considered, very intellectual and knowledgeable said, oh, well, yes, if you look at evolution, you can see that humans thrive. They function best when they are in peaceful communities. It leads to harmony, and therefore we have a gene. It's hardwired into us to seek peaceful communities. But I was sitting there thinking, well, yeah, but you can also look at the evidence from evolution to see that evolution kind of favors survival of the fittest, too, the strong dominating the weak. So it seems like from a purely atheist materialist perspective, you could also concoct a moral code in which beating up the weak and the poor and stealing their stuff so that you can be rich and your offspring can survive seems like that could also be perfectly justifiable from the atheist materialist perspective. And when I would bring up these issues, to sum up, there were a lot of discussions, but one summary of the typical response I got was along the lines of, shut up. Because again, a lot of these people wanted to be good people, and so they thought that I was saying, atheists want to be bad people or something, and I said, no, I just want to know how we derive a moral code from our own belief system, because it seems to me like you can't. And when I go toe-to-toe with atheists in the blog world, which is always a pleasure, because you know how wonderful people are when hiding behind the anonymity of the internet, that is one of the things that comes up a lot, that really sets people on fire when you bring up this question of how can you deduce a moral code? They don't have an answer. I waited for a good answer when I was in college. I still have not gotten one. So I had those questions in my mind, but I was still very much an atheist, because one thing that my dad instilled in me well was this idea of you might not like where the truth leads you. It might not be comfortable but you follow the truth nonetheless. We look for what is true, not what makes us feel good. And so I was concerned about these issues of moral code, but in the spirit of seeking truth, I was still committed to being an atheist. The first thing that just made me, really question even more than I already had been, that made me start to consider at least theism, was when I met the man who is now my husband. So he has an interesting story. He was raised by a single mother, grew up very, very poor, so much so that they often couldn't even afford to run the heat in the winter, which is sad, but it was Texas. I mean, it wasn't like, here. And so her big thing, because she grew up in poverty, like no running water poverty. And so her big thing was, you've got to get out of poverty, you've got to seek success. And she had heard on like movies and TV shows of these places called like Yale and Harvard. And so knowing nothing about it, the blind leading the blind here, she was like, well, I think you should go to one of these schools. And my husband had never heard of him. He was just a kid from, small town Texas. And he said, okay, I guess I will. And so he went to Yale undergrad, graduated with honors, Columbia Law School, Stanford Business School, and did most of the coursework towards a master's in computer science while he was at Stanford. So no one could say he wasn't a pretty smart guy. So after we started dating, and I just assumed he was an atheist because, atheism is for the intelligentsia, right? I very much bought into that stereotype. And so one day something about the subject of religion came up, and he I forget what it was, but he said something that indicated that he believed in God. I said, God, whoa, what was that? Wow, that's crazy. And then he said the C word. He said he considered himself a Christian. I was just, I really, it was like, this is a dream, a bad dream, need to wake up now. I couldn't believe what he had just said. And so, but one of my first questions was a natural question. I was like, well, I have never seen you go to church. I have never seen you read the Bible. And, this is Austin. So he's like, oh, no, but I'm a Christian. You don't need to do anything, pray, go to church. Like, no, I'm still a Christian. Because he had a really profound experience. He did a full dunk baptism in a Baptist church when he was 13, and he said, I experienced something, and I know Christ is real, and I have no idea what to do about it, but I know that that he is real. And so I met some of his friends, some of these people who, from law school, so these people had degrees that I could not even pronounce. And some of them claimed to be Christian, people who their intellects blew me away. And so that was the first time that I had to let go of that silly, silly stereotype that smart people aren't religious. And looking back, when I first gave this talk, I actually didn't even mention that, because now it sounds so ignorant to say that I actually believed that smart people are never religious. But, that's the thing when you buy into stereotypes. Stereotypes always come from, you have this little worldview and you want to protect it, and so you make a stereotype so that everything in your world fits, very neatly within your perception, and you just get further and further into it. You further and further isolate yourself from reality. So that's what I had done, and hanging out with these really intellectual, really smart people was the first time that I thought, okay, I need to stop saying that belief in God is insane. I need to stop saying that no reasonable person could ever believe in God, because these people are really smart. They are very reasonable, and they believe in God. I didn't think they were right, but that was a first step. I let go of those silly stereotypes. So Joe and I got married, and this confirmed for me that he wasn't that religious, because we decided to reinvent the wheel on the wedding. We got married in a theater, and I wore a dark purple dress, and we had all these ideas. We were going to sign a contract, and we wrote our own vows. It was kind of a mess. But we learned a valuable lesson, one that I hope none of your children ever need to know. But if you are going to reinvent the wheel on a 2,000-year-old tradition or older, you might want to rehearse it first, because for all of these ideas about what our wedding was going to be like, we never timed it. And so we had all of these people that Joe knew flying in from all over the world. And I get up on the stage, and I have a dark purple dress on, And it was only 7 minutes, because we kind of didn't time that. And so as I was walking out, people were like, so I just flew in from London for she just walked up there and now it's done. So anyway, little lesson learned on when you go against thousands and thousands of years of tradition. So a year later, our first child was born, and that was the real starting point of my conversion. You can see that the stage had kind of already been set. I was already thinking a certain direction. But when I held that baby, that was the first moment of realizing that there were some real problems with atheism and that it was time to address them. Because, in the spirit of another thing that my dad always taught me was this idea of follow your beliefs to their logical conclusions. Don't just say you believe something, but then don't walk the walk when the going gets tough. You have to follow your belief to their logical conclusions. And so I held my newborn son, this amazing miracle, and I was like, what a gorgeous, randomly evolved set of chemical reactions. What is the atheism is nonsense. What is this? Because I remembered it when I was in college. There was this professor, I can't think of his name. Some of you have probably heard of him. He made the statement, he's a big atheist, he made the statement that it would be more morally acceptable to kill a newborn baby than an adult pig because pigs are more cognitively complex. And that has stayed with me all those years, because at the time that I read that paper, I was like, this is garbage, he's making atheists look bad. And I was like, that is wrong, because, because when people would ask me, every now and then I'd accidentally run into a religious person and even more accidentally get in a conversation about it. And sometimes they would ask me questions like, how do you know that human life is more valuable than, say, a gnat? And I would say and this is, quoting from other atheists, I'd say, well, obviously, we're more cognitively complex and we're more aware of the world. And so essentially complexity is how you derive value. And I looked at my newborn son and I thought, well, pigs are pretty smart. The pig is more cognitively complex than this newborn. And I realized that by my own atheist materialist worldview, I was saying that my baby was not as valuable as an adult human being because he was not as cognitively complex. So that was wrong. And then the biggest moment was when I sensed this love that I felt for him. And again, in the spirit of being, intellectually honest, I said, okay, where does this love come from that I'm experiencing? I thought, well, it's just a feeling, it's just chemical reactions in my brain, and I thought, that's not true. That is not true. I know that the love that I feel for my son and that I've experienced in this little family of ours has a source that is somewhere outside of us. I don't know what it is, I don't know who it is, but I know that it's there. And that if the whole world blew up tomorrow and there was nothing left of us, that love would still be real, and it would still exist. And that was the moment, thank you, it's true. And that was the moment that I was no longer an atheist. I didn't know what I was, but I was not an atheist. So I figured, because I grew up in Texas, we have religious people there, I figured that now is when I was supposed to say a prayer, but I never tried that. And I was not clear on how you distinguish talking to yourself from talking to God, but I gave it a shot. I literally said, I was like, is this thing on? How do I know when I'm talking to, or I thought maybe there could be gods. It's Austin, we're open-minded, I don't know. I didn't know what I was talking to, but I just sent out this really lame prayer just saying, if anyone is out there, this source of that love, I sense something, I know it's there. Whatever is at the source of this love, holla at me, let me know, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next, but, let me know that you're there. And what I didn't realize at the time is that I was actually responding to the grace of God that had already begun to work in my life, undoubtedly due to the prayers of many of the wonderful people that I met throughout my life that knew I was an atheist and were praying for me. I love this quote from the Catechism where it says, God calls man first. The living and true God tirelessly calls each person to that mysterious encounter known as prayer. In prayer, God's initiative of love always comes first. Our own first step is always a response. And so little did I know, I was simply responding to this hand that had been extended to me for so long. And that's a tip, by the way, for your loved ones who have fallen away. Encourage them to just pray. And I know they'll laugh. They'll say, that's ridiculous. Why would I pray? I don't believe in God. But what do you have to lose? All right, so you spend 2 minutes talking to yourself. How hard is that? Because as you'll see, when we get later into my story, that really started things in motion. That really opened a door for me, that first prayer, as lame as it was. What I did not understand, and this is another thing that you might want to convey if you suggest this to non-believers, is I thought that prayer was kind of an instantaneous thing. Like, you put the card into the ATM machine and you get money. I thought that, like, I would say the prayer, and then if there were a God or something, he would do something, like he's a magician or something that is like there to impress me. I don't know. I'm just picking things up from the culture, from the culture around me. So I said the prayer, nothing happened. And so I thought, well, I guess nothing is out there, or maybe there's something out there that's impersonal. I did not go back to atheism. I was 100% convinced that atheism was false, but I thought maybe there's not, the personal God that you hear about so much. So 7 months went by, and I had actually kind of forgotten about it. And then a funny thing happened. I was going to a bookstore to, find some reading to pass the time. I had no particular agenda. And it was a weird thing. As I was walking in the store, the only way I can describe it is to say that it's almost like there was a light on this one book at the back of the room. I mean, there wasn't literally, but I was so drawn to this book. And I just had to go see what it was. And so I had my baby with me, and I pushed the stroller back there. And I laughed when I saw that it was in the Christianity section. I mean, the last time I was in the Christianity section of anything was when I was in the 4th grade. I took the Bibles in our library, and I put them in the fiction section, which I thought was like the most edgy atheist joke the whole 4th grade had ever seen. But I hadn't been back to the Christianity section since. And I was about to walk away, but then I saw that the book was called The Case for Christ. And there was some tagline or something that said that the author used to be an atheist. And I thought, like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like, this will be fun. Take this book apart. That's, this is just going to be absurd. And I found that the book was actually not too bad. I mean, it's, now that I read it, it's written by a Protestant author named Lee Strobel, great guy, but, didn't necessarily have the fullness of truth. I wouldn't necessarily say that the book contains all the answers that you could ever want to know, but for me, at that time, it really planted a seed for me. It really piqued my interest. And one of the things is that I noticed this guy spoke my language. I believed that he was really an atheist. And this is another tip, one that I would find out later. There was something, especially at that time, and I still feel it a little bit, there's something that I would always sense, is that people who had always had faith, it's like we were speaking a different language. They would say something like, don't you feel chained down by the weight of sin? And I would be like, but I don't believe in sin. So we were just constantly missing each other. But this guy and C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, basically later I would find that what I needed to be doing was seeking out thinkers and authors who were once atheists themselves. And that really, they really knew how to speak my language. So anyway, in The Case for Christ, I'll just give you one example of a point that he made through interviews with Christian experts. He made some points that just kind of got me thinking. I wasn't convinced, but they got me thinking. Like, for example, a Protestant philosopher named J.P. Moreland, Strobel interviewed him, and this guy pointed out that what you see when you look at first century Palestine is that there were all these Jews that for centuries, through unspeakable persecution, they had held to these religious and social structures such as animal sacrifice and keeping the Sabbath, and nothing, not the worst persecution that the world could throw at them would get them to let go of these customs. And this is a quote from him in The Case for Christ. He says, these Jews, they believed that to abandon these institutions would be to risk their souls being damned to hell after death. Now, a rabbi named Jesus appears from a lower class region. He teaches for 3 years, gathers a following of lower and middle class people, gets in trouble with the authorities, and gets crucified along with 30,000 other Jewish men who are also executed during that period. But 5 weeks after he's crucified, over 10,000 Jews are following him and claiming that he is the initiator of a new religion. And get this, they're willing to give up or alter all 5 of the social institutions that they have been taught since childhood have such importance, both sociologically and theologically. And Moreland says, and it's kind of hard to argue with, you have to admit that something explosive happened to Jewish culture in first century Palestine. Atheist or Christian, you have to admit something happened. And his own explanation was simple. They'd seen Jesus risen from the dead. Got me thinking. Again, I wasn't convinced, but I thought, okay, that's an interesting point. I'll think about that. So that's what I did. I just kind of thought about it, but I thought that Joe would be excited since he was a Christian. Oh, and by the way, one thing, let me circle back and say, note that book was very much a result of that weak prayer that I had said earlier. If someone had given me that book the year before, I would have just made fun of it and set it aside. What initiated my openness to being able to receive some of the messages in that book is that I had begun to open myself to God's grace. So that's something to know, that it is not always the right time to throw books at our friends who are non-believers. You want to kind of wait and see that they have opened themselves a little bit to God's grace. So anyway, so I came home and I told Joe, like, oh, you won't believe this. You're going to be so excited. I am going to start reading about religion, that's what we nerds do. I said, I'm going to start researching religion, and guess what? I am going to put Christianity at the top of my list. And Joe, I think he was like eating or something, he was like, well, yeah, I guess you would start with the only lasting world religion whose founder claimed to be God. And I thought, like, oh, well, yeah, I guess that does make sense. And I thought, actually, that's been a move of, cult leaders throughout the ages to say, like, I'm God, give me all your money. And then they do the very ungodlike move of dying and staying dead, and their religions don't go very far. So I thought, yeah, I should have been exploring this Christianity thing all along. So I bought a Bible. Now, because I'm Protestant South, I know that's what you do, after you say your prayer, you buy a Bible. So I was like, all right, I'll get a Bible. Now, you have to understand, my ignorance, as in so many cases, was largely due to pride. I did, to their credit, I had some university classes where they tried to expose me to the Bible as cultural literature, but I was really into this idea that we live in a post-Christian culture, and so we don't need to read the Bible anymore, even as literature. So I was as ignorant of Scripture as you could possibly be and live in modern America. And every now and then when I was a kid, maybe even sometimes here in North Dakota, I would spend the night at a friend's house, and my parents were not morning people, so if the kids were going to church, my parents were like, we might be atheists, but we are not getting up early so that they can drop you home before they go to church, so just go to church with them. So I'd been to a few Sunday school services, and so my impression of the Bible was like, there were fishermen, and like we sang songs about like sheep and stuff. Like I really wasn't sure what to expect. But so I figured Jesus. I can't believe I'm admitting this. I did not understand the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I figured, okay, this is Jesus's book. So he probably comes in on like page 40, 50. Because you want to lead up to it. Probably don't put him there on page 1. So I open the Old Testament, and I'm like, hey, where are the sheep in like the songs about fishermen? And I'm in Leviticus like, what is wrong? Whoa. And Joe would come home from work, complaining about a problem, and I'd be like, Joe, have you tried killing a bird over a clay pot and dipping red yarn and hyssop in its blood? And he just looked at me, and I'd be like, it's in the Bible, I'm reading about it. So Joe finally clued me in. He said, you've got to stop. You've got to get to the New Testament. it's all going to make sense when you get there. So then, okay, so finally we have some talk about Jesus in the New Testament. Now, okay, I feel like we're going. So I read the whole New Testament, and it was amazing. It was, I could give a whole talk just on how it was different than what I would have expected. It was incredible to immerse myself in these scriptures. But I was still very confused, maybe more confused than before I read it, because this is going to sound silly, but I'm being very serious when I say I expected like what in sales they call like a call to action at the end. I mean, get to Revelation, like, wow, ooh, okay. And then the book just ends. And I thought, like, so what do I do now? And I didn't want to go to an external source, because I thought, like, well, surely we need to just trust the Bible and not, what other people are telling us to do. And the other thing that was confusing is I did not see a clear case for the traditional Christian moral code. Like, for example, I would say, I think I heard that Christians are against abortion and euthanasia. And I would look in the Bible, and it wasn't clear to me. And so then, like the, internet nerd that I am, so I'd go online and I'd Google, and I would see forums where people would say, like, oh yes, absolutely, Scripture is totally against euthanasia, and if you look at these verses, that's going to pretty much show you that it's right. But then the next person down the thread would be like, oh no, Christianity says it's fine in some cases, depending on the circumstances, so here are some other scriptures. And when I would ask the few religious people I knew, like, how do you know which one's right? They'd say, like, well, you have to study the scriptures and, read them in accordance with one another. And I thought, like, I have a 1-year-old. I mean, I'd love to study the scriptures, but are you telling me that you have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible in order to get the most basic questions answered? I mean, I would love to, but I thought, like, I don't have time to become a scripture scholar. And then some things that were kind of clear, but I wasn't sure if Jesus was talking to the people in that time and place or talking to us, because I get to the part where, he tells the rich man that you have to give up everything if you want to follow me. And I'm looking at my laptop like, whew, everything. And so I would ask Christians, like, do I have to, like, what, garage sale? I mean, like, how do I go about this? And they'd say, like, oh, no, don't worry. He was just talking to that one guy. But then I'd keep reading, and then we have the lesson for Mary and Martha, and they'd be like, oh, no, the focusing on the Lord instead of little tasks, no, that's for everyone. And I'd be like, do you guys have an appendix? Because, like, my version doesn't have one. I do not understand where you are getting these interpretations. And so Joe, like a good Protestant, was like, you need to buy a concordance. That's what's gonna, or a biblical encyclopedia. That's gonna, make it all make sense. And I was like, but if the writers of the concordance weren't inspired, by God, then why should I listen to them? That doesn't seem to make sense. And then the other thing I started to think about was widespread literacy is a brand new phenomenon in human history. I mean, if you look at the history of the world, and even a lot of places today, most people cannot read. And so I told Joe, I said, the system you're giving me of, like, I spend hours and hours, like, like studying the scripture and then looking at the concordance and the encyclopedia, I was like, it doesn't work if you have a job or, can't read. And the other thing is it requires the printing press. The printing press was invented in the 16th century. Before that, the average family probably could not even have a Bible, let alone a bunch of supporting documents. And so the question boiled down to paraphrase from the title of a Mark Shea book, which I highly recommend, it was very convincing to Joe, by what authority? Authority. I had all of these Christians making all of these claims about how to interpret the Bible and what the Christian moral code is. But I don't think I could have articulated it this succinctly, but I kept saying, by what authority? What gives you the authority to say that we interpret this verse this way and we interpret this verse that way? I was completely confused. So doing what people like me do, I started a blog in a very modern turn of events. And for those of you who aren't familiar with blogs, it's just a website that's easy to update, but the distinguishing feature is that it has, at the end of each little post that you write, there is a comments form where people can respond and you can have dialogues. And that's the big difference between a blog and other types of online media. So I didn't have any readers, and so I decided to recruit readers, and I knew just where I'd go. There was a website called the Raving Atheist, very aptly named. I cannot even hint at some of the things that this man would say about Christians. The hatred that he had for people of the faith was palpable. And I was aware of the site because he was the biggest atheist blogger at the time. But I noticed that he had this following of Christians who did an excellent job of responding to even his most hateful posts. And the other people in the comments, I mean, these Christians they did an amazing job of addressing atheist arguments. And one thing is they did it with charity and with peace. And I thought, man, if someone had said that to me, you can't even imagine what I would have responded with. And I saw these Christians, and there was this sense of, man, I want what they have, like that. I mean, that's superhuman, the way that they're able to deal with these people. But most importantly, at the time anyway, was that they could demolish atheist arguments. And one interesting thing is I recruited, I think, 6 people to come answer questions on my blog. I would find out later 5 of them were Catholic, these people that I had specifically identified as being able to demolish atheist arguments. And there were other people on there, but the ones that I picked out were all Catholic. So I had these Catholics reading my blog, and at the time I'm not sure if I even understood that they were Catholic. And so I started talking about these problems that I was having with Scripture. And so they told me a very interesting theory. They said, what if when God inspired the writers of the Bible, fallible people who make mistakes, but he inspires them to convey infallible truth? They said, what if he didn't stop doing that after the Bible was written? What if he kept doing that in a church that he founded with his own authority? And what if it is still around to this day? And I thought, that is a crazy question, isn't it? And I thought, that sounds really right. And then they told me they were talking about the Catholic Church, and I was like, oh, no, oh, come on, that is just ridiculous. And Joe, the Southern Baptist, was like, oh, you need to get away from the internet because these people they're talking crazy talk. But I had nowhere else to turn because I had pursued every other avenue. And so I just started reading, and Joe started reading. And as happens, I mean, those of you who are converts and reverts, I know this is going to resonate with you. You start to look into it, and you're like, well, why didn't someone tell me that there was all this great stuff here? I mean, CNN doesn't talk about this when they talk about the Catholic Church. I mean, we found this incredible moral code, and it was perfectly internally consistent. It didn't contradict itself, and it was full of this wisdom that was totally counterintuitive and yet so right. And the particular issue that really convinced us was the one of the issue of abortion and contraception. Joe and I both considered ourselves pro-choice, and we thought contraception was like air and water. I mean, it's like a needed thing that humans have to have. And when we realized that the church was right on that issue, we thought, I don't think this comes from people. I don't think we give people enough credit to come up with this and keep it going, especially this teaching that every Christian denomination agreed on these teachings about abortion and contraception up until the 1930s. And then as public opinion shifted, all the other churches shifted, except for the Catholic Church. So I started writing on my blog, like, guys, this is amazing. This teaching is so beautiful. Theology of the body. You need to listen to Dr. Janet Smith and read Christopher West. And God was up there like, ha, ha, ha. Watch what I'm about to do. So I was pregnant with my second child. I got a deep vein thrombosis, a life-threatening blood clot, and I was diagnosed with a blood clotting disorder that is exacerbated by pregnancy. And I was told by my doctors, you need to use like 10 different forms of contraception. And at the time, I wasn't even Catholic, and I thought, So now I'm the religious nut in the office. I mean, like a couple years ago I was the atheist, and like now I'm the religious fundamentalist. And it really put me in this difficult situation. And I hadn't told many people about our journey, but I told a few people. And their response was to say, like, well, just skip that one teaching, just be Catholic, but, don't follow that one, like, because that's crazy. I mean, nobody really, nobody does that in this day and age. And I'm as tempted as anyone to take the easy way out. But what Joe and I realized is that when you're asking a question of the Catholic Church, when you have a problem, there's really only one question to ask. And that is this church guided by God in its teachings or not? Because if it's not, then throw it all out. There's no need to listen to anything it says, including its claim that it chose the correct books for the canon of the Bible. But if it is, then to say that you know better than the church is to say that you know better than God. And I'm pretty arrogant, but I wasn't ready to go there. So we said, all right, we are going to trust God on this, and we are going to be Catholic all the way. We're not going to pick and choose. We are going to do this right. And so we decided to become Catholic, because what we had seen was that this church was more reasonable than atheism. At the time, I still thought that atheism was a somewhat reasonable view. I didn't think it was entirely crazy. But here, I had found a worldview and a philosophy that was more reasonable than atheism. And it is the only one I had ever encountered, and to this day have ever encountered, that I found more reasonable. We had gotten the answers to that question of by what authority. This was the authority that both Joe and I, and Joe in his life as a Protestant, and I in my conversion had been asking, like, how do you know that that's how the scriptures are supposed to be interpreted? That question was answered. It also answered the question of literacy, that question I'd had of, so what if you live in 1408 and you don't have the $1,000 for a Bible and you can't even read and you work 14 hours in the field? The Mass and the sacraments and the deposit of faith through the church, that answered all those questions about how those people can come to know God too. And interestingly, the scandals were going on at the time, and some people said, well, you've heard about all these things that are happening in the Catholic Church. Doesn't that concern you? And of course it did. It was terrible news that grieved us, and as it grieved all of you, I'm sure. But in terms of deciding whether or not this church was God's true church, in an odd way, it made the case more compelling, because what we were seeing on the news was nonstop coverage of the church is corrupt, especially its hierarchy, just bad people everywhere. They're so, they're so sinful, they're so corrupt. It's just all through the church and always has been. And so Joe and I thought, well, wait a minute. Corrupt, sinful, selfish people are always the first to sell out. They're always the first to just tell people in power whatever they need to hear so that they can get more power for themselves. And of course we knew that these media reports were largely inaccurate and completely biased, so it's not like we believed them, but they, some of the ones that were painting the church in the worst lights. But we said, if what the media is saying is true, then that makes it even harder to explain how this church has been around for 2,000 years. It is the largest continually operated organization in human history. It has stood strong and said things that make people furious for 2,000 years. Empire after empire has fallen away around it, and it is still speaking truth, and it won't go away. And how do you explain it if what you're saying is even 1% true, that its hierarchy is filled with imperfect people? It's really hard to explain. So in a way, all the anti-Catholic coverage in the media, it just gave me chills. I just thought, like, maybe a tiny portion of what they're saying about some people's faults is true, but this is God. People can't do this on their own. So in terms of the issue of what we did about, people often ask, well, what is the follow-up, with the contraception issue and, just having the deep vein thrombosis, and that it's a whole separate story, but I have a book coming out next year, so that'll give you all the details. But what we found, the short version is, it did work out, and what we found is that the rules that God gives us through his church, they are not necessarily easy, but they should be thought of, and this is an analogy I heard an amazing priest use once. They are more a prescription for living a life of peace and love than they are a set of confining laws. And so, was it always easy to follow that prescription? Is it to this day easy to follow the prescription? No, it's not. God never said it would be. But when you follow it, it's given to us through the perfect doctor who wants only the best for us. And when you follow that prescription, you will find that your life is filled with peace and with love. And what we found with all the struggles that we faced and continue to face with this clotting disorder of mine is that God does not ask us to have all the answers. He just asks us to be faithful. In conclusion, Joe and I became Catholic at Easter Vigil in 2007, and thank you. And actually, I'll tell you, we have time, I'll tell you a quick little bonus story. I often save this for later, but after we became Catholic, we had my son baptized. He was 3. I learned, lots of different denominations disagree about infant baptism, but everyone agrees that toddler baptism is a terrible idea. Up in the front of the church, he screamed that he did not want to be baptized and kicked and screamed through the whole thing. Screamed his way out of the church. So that's a lesson. Like, if you have kids who are not sure if they're going to get their children baptized, tell them to do it early. Don't want to do it when they're a toddler. So that morning, I was praying, and I said, Lord, how did I get here? I came from so far away, and I've, at any moment I could have taken a wrong turn and ended up on a completely different path. And I was running around trying to find something to wear. I'd wear almost all black. I had nothing white to wear to a baptism. And I pulled open a drawer, and something slid to the front, and it was a candle. It was my baptism candle. My mother came from a Catholic family. She doesn't like to go into detail. She was very fallen away. I didn't really know that side of the family closely, certainly not those grandparents. They passed away when I was very young, and they were also from a different part of the country than us, and her siblings fell away as well. So it was kind of this little relic that, there was something about, Catholic, that sounds familiar. To give you an idea of how little that Catholic heritage was passed on to me, at one point, I asked a question, and someone answered with the rhetorical question, is the Pope Catholic? And I had to take the person next to me aside and say, is the Pope Catholic? I really didn't know if it was a rhetorical yes or no. But, they came from a cultural Irish Catholic family. And before my grandparents passed, they did ask that I be baptized as an infant. And so when I said that prayer, Lord, how did I end up here? I was literally saying those words as I opened the drawer and I found that candle. And it was it was an answer from the Lord that the grace of my baptism had been working in my life all along. And thank you. Remember that when you have loved ones who have fallen away, the grace of baptism is real and it works. And remember the Raving Atheist blogger I told you about. I didn't hear from him after I didn't see a site after I became Catholic. The next year at Christmas, he had a new post up for the first time in a year. It was a picture of our Lord, and it said, I dedicate my life to the service of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. He is now a Catholic pro-life activist. And what his story taught me, that I hope that my story teaches you, is that nobody is ever so far lost that they are beyond the reach of God's grace. Thank you.